Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 64 being recorded on November 16, 2022. So we have some content left over from last week that basically is going to be the basis of this week's streams. We covered a lot of the election stuff, and we're not going to be really revisiting that strongly unless there's specific questions about it in the chat. We had some things about the housing crisis, about COVID, what else is new, and also some articles about organizing the unemployed. I'm not sure if we're going to get to those today or tomorrow, but we'll be getting to them this week, and then that will kind of clear out stuff that I have pulled so far, plus, whatever kind of questions come up in the chat. And that's the plan. So, yeah, let's get into it. I'm going to check what's going on in the chat, and we can also just review what's been posted since last stream. Kind of just a couple of odds and ends. I posted a copy on the channel of a movie by blacklisted directors and writers called Salt of the Earth. That is a 1954 dramatization of a real-world 1951 strike against a zinc company in New Mexico. And that movie was pretty badly suppressed. There have been books and essays written about the suppression of Salt of the Earth. We need more stuff like that. I think there's a lot of, especially in young adult literature now, and these get made into movies a lot, kind of like a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff, or things like the Hunger Games, where it's like some hero fighting, against the totalitarian government or something like that. And there's not really a lot of sort of mass organizing. It's this sort of almost like petty bourgeois, like adventurist heroism kind of stuff going on. And no doubt, there are heroic revolutionaries, but it's sort of less of a focus on the mass organizing and more like some, tiny group of rebels or something like that. And, in the real world, revolutions are supported by the mass of the people, or they don't really come off. And there's, not a lot of depiction of that in the media. I would love to see a switch towards that, especially, now that we're in kind of a media environment where there's sort of real big movies and real tiny movies. We were talking about this with the Matt Damon clip where he was explaining how, the funding of the movie industry has changed. But now it's kind of like, you see this across music and across other things. You have the super big megastars and the record labels, and then of course in movies the analog would be studios. They'll promote their sort of like really huge, like Taylor Swift or really big acts like that, and then everything else is kind of this free for all of people getting funded through Bandcamp and stuff like that. And it's kind of the same in movies. So there's more independent movie making. The problem is you won't necessarily see it easily. But we could definitely see more independent films being made about real world, strikes, struggles of proletarian organizing and things like that. There are movies out there. I'd like to post more. I have a number of books on the topic of like labor in films. Salt of the Earth is a good example. There's other ones like Adrian Brody was in something called Bread and Roses a while back that I think depicted the Justice for Janitors, if that's the name of the campaign. So it was like a union organizing building cleaners. And it was a pretty realistic look at, what organizing a union actually looks like, trying to persuade workers to join in the thing, and all of the fears and risks that, workers have to confront and take in the union process. But anyway, Salt of the Earth is an interesting look at, different people's attitudes towards picketing. And, you're really stepping out of what is expected and allowed, breaking a lot of norms in this society. So it is taking a big risk and kind of putting a bullseye on you, not just, by the capitalist goon squad or whatever that might be hired to break the strikes, but you're risking a lot of social disapproval in doing that. So, it's interesting to see how that plays out in real life, and it's oftentimes like pretty gritty and very stressful and not very romantic. but it's stuff that needs to get done, and it's, stories that should be told. Anyway, and then I threw up a little clip, Soviet media portrayals of the United States in 1986, CIA response to Soviet media in the 80s and the things that they were telling their people about the United States, which I really couldn't find anything inaccurate about it. Maybe the only quibble I had was they were talking about Rambo, specifically, Sylvester Stallone movie, being part of a tide of like very violent militainment kind of stuff. That I think is a bad example because while Rambo is a very violent movie, it's a movie about PTSD and from serving in an imperialist war, specifically Vietnam in that case. So I don't think it actually reflects super well on the military-industrial complex. Now the later Rambo sequels, that's a different story, because Rambo basically gets recruited in part two to like go rescue POWs and stuff, and it's a totally ludicrous plot and thoroughly anti-communist in every way. But anyway, not to like that was like the only quibble I had with it. Finally, I put up a mirror of a video called "Is Dugin a Non-Fascist?" by another channel, Russian channel, Agitprop Konstantin Semen, and I just used Google's auto-translate subtitles into English. It's not perfect, which you'll see as soon as you start watching it. I kind of just put this up on the channel. There was somebody who, I exchange notes with sometimes on research and things like that, and she does a lot of stuff with like Russian and Chinese capitalism, and pointed this out to me, and I wanted to point it out to the rest of the audience. The subtitles are far from perfect, but if you there's also a link to the original video, and if you click on that, you can get some slightly maybe easier to read subtitles. But again, everyone is welcome for my pointing the existence of this video out to them. It's called Alexander Dugin's Fascism. That's what I labeled it as. Basically, this guy went through early 90s sort of underground neo-Nazi zines, basically, and found Dugin's writings. And it's very, very typical fascist writings. Some of them have to do with the Orthodox Church and how they're basically... So one of the things about fascism is if you look at people like Julius Evola, there's these kind of ties of fascist mysticism and real conservative mystery religion being woven into it in ways... Like one of the things about fascism that they often promote is radical traditionalism and this kind of obscure religious teachings. And he was basically saying that Orthodox Christianity, as is practiced in Russia, can be a good vehicle for that kind of, fascist mysticism that is a thread throughout the history of fascism. So that's one of the things they talk about, the Eurasian Empire and all that kind of shit. So yeah, Dugin's a fascist. This is super clear. For people who can listen to all that and still not understand that Dugin is a fascist, you need to actually brush up on what fascism is. Go back to, stuff from the 20s, 30s, 40s. This is not new. And, look at the kinds of tropes that the old school fascists and Nazis were actually talking about, and then you can actually understand the threat. And then there's, neo-fascism after World War II, which is a bit more internationalist. And there's people like the guy who wrote Imperium, Yaki, Francis Parker Yaki. So it's sort of mutated over time, but there's certain threads in it that are consistent. And, you get a lot of these populist opportunists in the Jimmy Dore or maybe RBN orbit, for example. People like Kim, dumbest person alive, other people. I think she's now in the LaRouche Schiller Institute orbit. I saw Caleb Muppet was retweeting her because she was talking about the land bridge recently. So all this sort of LaRouche, Duginist, like there's different flavors of neo-fascism, and these different populist opportunists are sort of weaving it together in different ways. People like Jimmy Dore running PR for Giorgia Meloni, how is that fascist? How is that fascist? Well, she's talking about gunning down migrant boats to sink them in the ocean. If you don't think that's fascist, maybe your, fascism compass is broken, or maybe at a minimum you're completely desensitized to the kind of politics you're exposed to in the United States, for example. So anyway, that's what's new on the channel, and let's get into the chat. So, oh yeah, and of course this went up on the community tab. I would be remiss, I think, not to share this. It's just like there's no shame whatsoever. Speaking of all these, neo-fascist, we got Jackson Hinkle posing with Jordan B. Peterson with the quote or caption on the tweet, "The globalists don't stand a chance." And then there's a ninja emoji at Jordan B. Peterson, and it's a photo of them posing together. Peterson has his arm around young, impressionable male Hinkle, which of course that's Jordan Peterson's bread and butter, is insecure right-wing men that he can turn into being their worst possible selves. Would you two like to be strung out on anti-anxiety medication, go into a coma, eat an all-beef diet? Somebody was like, his colonoscopy is going to be directed by John Carpenter. Anyway, so yeah, let's get into the chat here. How has my day been? Fine. I've had better, I've had worse. Let's see. Somebody says, I recently got into it with a comrade of mine about Russia's imperialism. He doesn't believe Russia can be considered imperialist since their actions are anti-American, aka anti-imperialist. Well, to stop there, was the UK and similar countries, France, the United States, were they imperialist at the time of World War II? Okay, so they got into a fight with Germany and Italy in World War II, and Japan. Were Germany and Italy and Japan imperialist? So if they were, and they were fighting, clearly as is demonstrated with the other imperialist powers, then an inter-imperialist war is entirely possible. Okay, so there's a very clear example. Also, Lenin wrote about this extensively at the time of World War I. So it shows that they have not read Lenin. So I don't know if this person that you were getting into it with is, considers themselves a Marxist-Leninist or reads Lenin or anything like that. We have many, many texts in a playlist about Marxism and the national question. I've done many texts, Lenin in particular, talking about nationalism and war, and his many references to the inter-imperialist war. So just because somebody is fighting against an imperialist power does not mean that they themselves are not also imperialist. This has been established, again, since at least Lenin's time. So anyway, there's a start. And if they're still refusing to do it, then just say, look, what you're espousing is not Leninist in any way, so you can stop calling yourself a communist now. Anyway, continuing, he also pointed out that the dictionary definition of imperialism, well, we're not going off of the dictionary definition of imperialism unless you're reading from a Marxist-Leninist dictionary, all right? So, I mean, if this is the basic problem, you want to use a definition of imperialism that is not Marxist, great. Then you're not a Marxist, and I don't know, how much we have to talk about in terms of specific analysis, but anyway. He pointed out that the dictionary definition of imperialism would classify any and all countries that exert their will during warfare as imperialist, which he doesn't think makes sense. Again, we use a specific definition of imperialism. It is the highest stage of capitalism, and there are a number of characteristics of that. It's as distinct from the earlier stage of capitalism, when capitalism is still getting established, and it's overthrowing feudalism, and it's pretty much the Wild West. It's not terribly consolidated. There's still a lot of small-scale capitalist production, and it hasn't been consolidated into what we would know today as the military-industrial complex, finance capital, which is where industrial capital and financial capital, industrial capital being, factories, things where things are manufactured, and financial capital, banks and things like that make profits off of interest. those basically get fused as the financial capital gets so powerful that their control over lending to the industrial capitalists kind of subsumes everything into one thing. So that's a characteristic of it. Monopoly production rather than small scale production with a lot of competition, etc. So Marxist Paul has a video on Is Russia Imperialist? Politsturm, Politsturm, also has a good video, Is Russia Imperialist? They both, in about 20 or 25 minutes each, make a very clear case that Russia is in fact imperialist, because again, imperialism is that later stage of consolidated capitalism. Russia is very demonstrably in that stage. So now, some people do mental gymnastics, like we saw Caleb Maupin ally Dust James. Some people may be familiar. He's sort of a more minor or like mid-tier patriotic socialist, Pat Sock, neo-fascist. So he tries to make a case that Russia is, quote, post-imperialist. It's a bunch of utter fucking nonsense. But yeah, so people do mental gymnastics to try to get around this basic point. It's really not overly complicated when you break it down. You're kind of either... excuse me. We pretty much recognize two major stages of capitalism. That earlier stage when it's ascendant, and then after it gets established, goes into monopoly production, all that kind of stuff. Lenin wrote about this numerous times, and it's kind of in one or the other pretty much. So Russia obviously was socialist at one point, so it regressed and reverted back into capitalism. But if imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and they had actually gone beyond that at one point, then fell back into capitalism. Well, they didn't fall back into the early stage of capitalism. It's dominated by monopolies and things like that. And so after capitalism gets completely established throughout the domestic market, it has to keep expanding. And it goes out into other countries, and where it butts heads with other imperialists also trying to expand their operations out and export capital to new countries, they get into wars sometimes. Sometimes they solve it, quote, like gentlemen, but war is the continuation of business by other means. That quote goes in both directions, And anyway, you get what we have right here. So, yeah. I got called a liberal for suggesting to communists that they ought not to support Putin and Russia. So let me just make a blanket statement now. I've been wrestling with this since the beginning of this channel. The depth of the opportunism and neo-fascists masquerading as Marxist-Leninists caught me by surprise. I was honestly very surprised and shocked by this. But I've been wrestling with it for 2.5 years. At least half of the people calling themselves Marxists, and specifically Marxist-Leninists, are just neo-fascists. A lot of them don't even know the difference because they don't do the fucking reading. But they listen to some streamer, some, Infracell, Caleb Muppet, Jacksman Hinkoff, like whoever they're listening to, they're not really doing the reading, they're not doing the analysis, or they're just some troll. If you don't actually know this person, could just be some troll at a troll farm. But we've done enough of the readings here on the channel to demonstrate thoroughly, as have other channels, as I just mentioned. This is what's going on, and a lot of these people again are just neo-fascists. It's that simple. Particularly if they're talking about Dugin and stuff like this. This is neo-fascism. They may or may not even be aware of it. They may be kind of clueless, but bottom line is that is what it is, and it's super depressing because you just have to move through it. For me, again, starting the channel, I was blown away, shocked by how extensive this was. And so it's a small movement even counting those people, who of course are not part of the movement, but it appears that way from the outside. Then you get into it and you're like, oh, half of even what is a very small movement is people who are just aggressive conservatives, i.e. fascists. And so then, it's half as big as the small thing that it appeared to be in the first place. But you just got to move through it and don't tolerate that garbage. So, yeah. Somebody's complaining about the mod. We'll talk about this later. I have no idea we got timed out. I don't know. For the record, I don't care about emojis as long as you're not completely clogging up the chat. I don't know. I don't know what happened, but they've been doing a good job modding so far. So that's all I can really say. But best not to start getting crazy with the complaining about it because nobody really likes that. Yeah, Peterson is a warm blanket for the incels. He is their safe space. Yeah, I mean, he just affirms all the kind of non-scientific, antisocial stuff that they believe in. It's all the feminists' fault, whatever. All the stuff that he says. Speaking of fascism, another commenter had a lengthy discussion with someone today that tried claiming Jordan Peterson wasn't a fascist despite him saying shit like the Holocaust was a series of logical conclusions. Hitler, yeah, because Peterson will go on with like, I don't like Nazis, I don't like them, but oddly enough, this is that meme of the little sketch. It's in Germany, and the guy's leaning against the wall, and the Nazi in full regalia walks by. It's like set in 1938, and he calls the guy a Nazi, and he's like, "What did you just call me?" He's like, "Well, I called you're a Nazi, right?" And he's like, "Oh, excuse me, that's very insulting." No one wants to be called a fascist. They can be sitting there reading directly out of Mein Kampf, but if you call them a fascist, forget it. Nobody wants to be called a fascist. Very, very few people do. Very, very few do. So, but plenty will espouse those views. Why? Because capitalism's in crisis, and fascism has to be resurrected to try to, hold back any kind of systemic change. They want to get people off the scent of socialism, off of organizing to replace capitalism, and they need to get aggressive, and this means fascism. So. Yeah, his followers are like a cult. I mean, they don't really have critical thinking skills and etc. So, as far as de-radicalization being a fool's errand, I think on a one-on-one basis it can be, unless you know the person and there's some hope that you can appeal to their humanity. But we do need to put out anti-fascist materials for the sake of at least rallying people who are not predisposed to it, fascism. But yeah, I mean, that can be used by people who have gotten sucked in somewhat to maybe, find the trail of breadcrumbs back into some kind of a pro-worker position. We would like to see people abandon fascism, for sure. But yeah, trying to, quote, convert people one-on-one, that's not really, I don't think, how it works. What we need to do is build movements, put out educational materials, build momentum, pull people into that momentum. But yeah, they do have to abandon the fascism, and that is their choice. You can't make it for them. Yeah, Jordan Peterson is one of the biggest anti-communists in the U.S. and Canadian media. Wonder if he will also join the LaRouche gang. I mean, so far he has his own stuff going on that he doesn't really need to, but fascism makes strange bedfellows. We'll see. Yes, debate bros do just want to hear the sound of their own voice. Yeah, we really do not profit by debating people for the most part. If there is a sincere, committed comrade who, you have a dialogue with and you agree with on a lot of the issues, but there's some, kind of minor point or, moderate point about strategy or something like that, that could be worth a conversation. I think at that point, it really wouldn't even properly be called a debate, though. It would just be like a discussion about some question facing the movement. But as soon as it starts getting framed as this competitive debate, that's where it gets gamified, and I think a lot of just bullshit starts happening there. And again, a lot of these, quote, debates are really just spectacles that right-wingers use to prop themselves up, to get themselves some more spotlight, and that kind of thing. The left does not really profit from these things at all. So, yeah, I mean, down with debate broism. and don't look back. The LaRouchites are not conservative. What? Yes, they are. They believe that there's no limits to growth, and they call environmentalists green fascists. They're very definitely conservative. That's why all the people promoting them are also like anti-feminist and reactionary on all kinds of social issues. Yeah, they're very definitely conservative, actually. Yeah, Peterson calls himself a classical liberal. It's something libertarians have been hiding behind for a long time. A quote free thinker who just happens to be for the status quo and actually even more of the status quo. That's what libertarian crypto fash is all about. It's deriding neoliberalism while calling for literally more neoliberalism. Privatize, deregulate, and defund uh, whatever public programs are there. So yeah, defund the public stuff, cut down social democracy, privatize whatever you can, and then deregulate the private sector. This is what it's all about. This is what they call for, and it's not coincidentally what we've been living through for like 45 years or so. This is the neoliberal era. It basically is libertarianism, but the more aggressive they get about it, it just turns into fascism. We got a comment here, and I have to laugh. Do you think purity testing will help defeat empire and hegemony? What the fuck is purity testing in this context? Um, can you be a bit more specific? They continue, if you want to fight the most brutal and bloodthirsty empire in human history, you have to set aside your personal morality. So I think that people who are communists and talk about that there's not going to be you know how to phrase this. People who are communists understand capitalism is not going to go quietly. I don't know what you're talking about with purity testing. Perhaps you would care to be a bit more specific rather than hiding behind these idiotic buzzwords that you picked off of some podcast or stream somewhere. Somebody asks, what do we mean by socialism? I mean, as the Hammer and Sickle suggests, this is a Marxist channel leaning towards Marxism Leninism, but we attempt to do Marxist unity as much as that is a thing. Okay, so here's a question. I don't know if this is a dumb question, but if I own my own company and I am the only employee, is that the best thing to do as a socialist because I'm not exploiting anyone else and can limit the exploitation on yourself? That isn't how it works, but I'll explain. Or is a union better as far as existing under capitalism? Bottom line for work, you do what you need to do to survive is my basic, position. If you are, working as some kind of like accurately working as an independent contractor, a lot of employees do get miscategorized by their employers as independent contractors just so that they don't have to pay you benefits. But if you're really, have some skill and can start your own company, right now, just do what you need to do to survive. But as far as it being the quote best thing, the best thing is whatever is going to lead to more class consciousness and organizing. So, if you're doing what you're able to do right now, the point here is keep your politics, even if you wind up, not organizing with other employees, keep your politics aligned with, remember, in other words, even if your class interests temporarily become petty bourgeois, uh, try not to let your consciousness get overly affected by that. Remember, you can fall back into being a proletarian at any point in time. And just, keep that in mind. This is a thing where, petty bourgeois people can support proletarian politics, not out of an immediate class interest, but out of a future class interest, understanding that, their status as petty bourgeois is fleeting, particularly if they're down near the bottom of being petty bourgeois. But so as far as it limiting the exploitation, so we talk about exploitation in a Marxist sense as coming from the extraction of surplus value. So if you're not having employees and nobody has you as an employee, that's not surplus value. Um, as far as this really being a break from the capitalist system, it isn't, because all of your vendors and landlord and all the other business to business commerce that you're going to be doing is going to be with other capitalists, many of whom are much larger than you and are profiting off of you. So I mean, in other words, whether you have a small business where you're paying yourself, $40,000, $50,000 a year, or whether you're a proletarian and you're getting paid $40,000, $50,000 a year, there's not a huge difference. My point is, just because you're not an employee, don't let it go to your head. Remember, the difference between you and a proletarian is like a sneeze away. So no, I mean, it's not. The best thing right now, I would say, is just do what you can do to survive. Because even going out there, if you don't currently have a job as an employee, going looking for one might make you way worse off. So, I mean, do what you can do to survive, but keep your politics communist to the best extent you can. This is a clumsy way of phrasing this, and it's not a dumb question, but yeah, I wouldn't say it's the best thing to do as a socialist. The best thing you can do as a socialist is try to survive financially and contribute to the movement. That's the best thing that I can say that you should do. Even if you're not in a union, if you see people striking, support them, bring them food, contribute to their strike fund, spread their message on social media, etc. So the best thing you can do is try to survive and help other people to survive and help to organize the movement. So, and you can do all that stuff even if you're, self-employed with no employees and whatever. Yeah, so on Jordan Peterson, he also loves Viktor Orban. He got a medal from him. There's a lot of cross-pollination between Orban and the Canadian and U.S. left, or right wing. I'm still thinking about that last question. Okay. Yeah, like the Republican Party, they have workshops on like how to be more like Orban. Let's see. I feel like fascism is like racism, sort of the baseline in the US. In fact, you have to admit your own fascism and racism in order to actually move forward to being anti-racist, anti-fascist. I agree. I mean, if you've been socialized in the United States, especially if you're white, you're definitely going to need to, like, you have been brought up to help enforce the status quo, whether you realize it or not, and you've gotten those messages of, values communications many, many times since you were a baby. And yeah, you have to do a lot of conscious work on doing that and recognizing it before you're going to be able to contribute anything meaningful. And that's not gatekeeping, that's not purity testing, that's a statement of fact. You are going to just bring that shit into the movement unless you extract it from your own brain first. And that means, re-socializing yourself. And it's not easy because a lot of this stuff gets into your brain when you're a kid. Your brain is literally more plastic as a child, and you spend time in altered states of consciousness where you learn things and they get sort of deeply embedded in your subconscious. So it takes a lot of work to undo that. I mean, years worth. But unless you do that, you're going to be bringing in those racist and fascist values into the movement. So, unintentionally, but it's going to be there. And it's just kind of a matter of time before it comes out again. And let's throw in sexism and heterosexism as well. Those are other common faces of this. The bigotry that we're all taught. And, it varies by region in the United States. Some places are much more overt about all this stuff, and some places are more covert and So it's going to take different types of deconditioning and resocialization. LaRouche is cringe, but they're against empire. No, they're not. So, again, we were discussing this before. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. LaRouche is not socialist at all. End of story. You do not have meaningful anti-imperialism without socialism. And LaRouche has been working with governments for years, selling them intelligence. They are pro-capitalist all the way. We have a clip of LaRouche in a previous... look up the Evans and Novak 1986 interview with LaRouche. He lays it right on the line. He is not Marxist. He is a constitutional traditionalist. And this is more of the same kind of like, oh, we can align with the Ron Paul people. No, you can't. They say that they're, against war. Libertarians are like, oh, we're anti-war and anti-cop. Okay, what are you for? Well, we're for completely deregulated capitalism. Guess what? You can't have advanced capitalism without a police state and empire. You can't do it. It's fundamental to the nature of capitalism. So this is why we have people confused about, oh, they're against empire. No, they might say some things against the U.S., but not even entirely. LaRouche is so twisted, it's ridiculous. But in addition to being a cult, so I mean, there's that whole angle to it too. No, LaRouche is going to give you just neo-fascist stuff. Yeah. It's not. It has nothing to do with morality. It has to do with the fact that it's not anti-imperialism. No, it isn't materially against empire. It's. I don't know what you're not hearing about this, but no, it isn't. Anyway, enough said. There's not really anything else to it. You will never build the forces strong enough without LaRouche. Tell you what, somebody needs to leave the chat. Guess what? We will build the forces strong enough without LaRouchian neo-fascists. Because they're not part of the movement, they're against us, and they don't want any of the things that we want. All right? End of story. Yeah, so the saying goes that fascism is capitalism in decline. I prefer to say capitalism in crisis, but yeah, I think that does a good job of defining the relationship. We shouldn't use the buzzword purity testing. Upholding a line is more accurate. Upholding a standard, upholding a principle. Purity testing. This is something that right-wingers say when you're not being right, when you're rejecting their right-wing nature. This is something that, Hillary Clinton said to Bernie Sanders. It's something that is brought up when people are trying to hold left politics in, or, something to the left of what's being said. Oh, purity testing, you're purity testing. No, we're trying to actually stick to Marxism-Leninism, If you want to become an opportunist, you can become an opportunist, but stop calling yourself Marxist at that point and just be the capitalist that like embrace the capitalism that you're actually espousing and just stop calling it socialism. I really wouldn't care so much. It's like Joe Biden. Somebody was like, is Joe Biden an opportunist? No, he's just a fucking neoliberal. Like, he doesn't call himself a socialist. But it's these people calling themselves Marxist or crypto-Marxist or socialist or whatever that aren't. That's opportunism. Because they're trying to mislead you and create pacts with interests diametrically opposed to our own who cannot be part of the movement. Yeah, you have to rid the movement of reactionaries, opportunists, and reformists. Otherwise, the vanguard is going to end up just being another instrument of bourgeois class interest. So yeah, there's plenty of opportunist communist parties around the world. If you want to end up like them, completely useless, then allow the reformism, allow the opportunism, allow the revisionism, and you too can have a completely useless party that maybe it will attract some members, but it's not communist anymore. So you're just deluding yourself. Yeah, go go build the land bridge, cultist. All right, let's. Didn't LaRouche brainwash a bunch of communists and physically torture them? Yeah, so they got into this. You can read. It's right in the wiki article. You don't even have to dig that far. It's also been written about in many books about LaRouche. Yeah, they had Operation Mop Up, which, incidentally, Caleb, we were mentioning earlier, was, and I have this up on the community tab if you scroll back a few months, was saying Operation Mop Up sounds really good to me right now. That was Caleb Mop Up talking about that. Yeah, that's where the LaRouche people physically attacked the CPUSA. This is back in the 70s, and some other groups. So, there you go as far as like your purity testing. Jesus. Yeah, I think, people would rather not be beaten with lead pipes for being communists by their supposed fucking allies. All right, let us now get into some current events. And what should we start with? Let's get through the COVID stuff real quick. No major updates here, just COVID continues to go on. And they're predicting a surge around Thanksgiving. The west portion of the U.S. is in a surge now, but it's kind of just starting. I don't know. I mean, it's been holding steady. Let's put it that way. We've had a huge plateau this year of COVID, many, many millions of cases. And therefore, 20% of those roughly end up in long COVID, some kind of organ damage or persistent infection or other things that result in lasting things going on. And even death, not during the acute stage, but people who get COVID are much more likely to die within the next 12 months than people who didn't get COVID. Even if you make it through those first 3 weeks or whatever. We highlighted a case recently, Julie Powell, a writer who wrote that movie Julie and Julia, and she got COVID really bad. According to her tweets, she was, quote, sick as a dog. She recovered, then 6 weeks later died of a heart attack at 49. So, coincidence? Probably not. Anyway, so COVID keeps on trucking. We haven't had quite a spike yet. Of course, it's also not quite Thanksgiving yet. But we're going to look at an article talking about how there's like a whole, like half a dozen, it's like a family of different variants that are surging. But my real point about this is Europe, like the UK, after Omicron, there's that big spike in December and January. Then that subsided, and then they got a big BA2 spike like early in March, and it really looked like a mini Omicron, where it was a big spike. And so people were expecting that here in the US also. But that isn't what we got. We got a lot of COVID, but it wasn't in a spike. What happened is we got a slow ramp up from March through April into May, where it was just going up and up and up at about a 40-degree angle on the wastewater chart. And then it plateaued at a very high level. And then it even had a bump, but it just sustained that way as a plateau for months and months. It wasn't like this big spike. And it's partly because multiple strains were involved. It was first driven by BA2 and some leftover strains. Then BA4 and BA5 came in, and it sustained it, and then even gave it kind of a bump. Now we're in this thing where there are multiple competing strains, and we haven't had a big surge yet, but it's been sustaining the level. And it's kind of just as bad because, the bottom line is millions of people are getting COVID. Anyway, so just a one panel here. Lots of interesting studies from Dr. McIntyre on N95s. These are high-quality masks. You should be wearing them, not surgical masks, not cloth masks. Get N95s or KN95s or some of the other standards, whatever it is, like the FF2s, FF3. In this randomized trial, continuous use of N95 in healthcare workers led to significantly lower clinical respiratory illness and bacterial colonization of respiratory tract compared to medical masks. So yeah, forget the surgical masks because they do not create an airtight barrier. Go for the N95s, KN95s, and similar. Personally, I would just recommend the N95s. There's also N99s, there's P100s. All those are good. You want it to be at least 94, 95 and up. So yeah, for all the people about, masks don't work and this and that, as long as you're using a good mask, they absolutely do work. All right, what else do we have here? So this is what I was just saying. This is from Fortune Well. Forget about a single strain. The new COVID calculus is all about viral families by Aaron Prater, October 29. Let's get to the next page here. Gone are the simple, early COVID pandemic days of 2020, at least in terms of viral evolution. The transfer of power used to be relatively straightforward from variant to variant, from the original strain to Alpha to Delta to Omicron, one washing over the world before another took over. Now, it's a battle royale between prominent viral families, warring to keep power within their lineage. No single family, BA5, XBB, nor BQ. By the way, BQ is part of BA5, and all of these are part of the Omicron family of mutants. But Omicron has now branched out and diversified a lot. Anyway, no single sub-branch of Omicron, BA5, XBB, nor BQ, has achieved global success this fall, not yet at least. As the virus behind COVID, namely the Omicron variety, mutates at an unprecedented rate, the focus of scientists has shifted from single strains to related groups of them. Case in point, XBB, a combination of two different Omicron spawns that began surging in Singapore and Bangladesh in recent weeks. It has yet to arrive in the US, at least officially, but its grandchildren, XBB 1.1 and XBB 1.3, have, according to data from GISAID, an international research organization that tracks changes in COVID and the flu virus. These days, it's risky to look at one country and assume that because it's experiencing a certain wave, another country will soon experience the same. Ryan Gregory, a professor of evolutionary biology at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, told Fortune, quote, "The XBB surge that Singapore sees may not be the one that we see in the US," he said. The summer that changed everything. As far as viral evolution goes, all was relatively simple through the, quote, stealth Omicron surge earlier this year, experts say. A new variant would materialize and the number of cases would surge, vacillate a bit, then fall like clockwork. But the calculus changed this summer with BA5. The new generation Omicron spawn surged globally, then surged again in some places like Germany and France. Meanwhile, in other countries, fellow Omicron strains, XBB or BQ, or their descendants, began to swell. Today, there are hundreds of Omicron strains, all with mutations that provide increased transmissibility, the ability to escape immunity, the potential to cause more severe disease, or a combination thereof. So, just to remind everybody on the escaping immunity, some of these strains, we do not have any monoclonal antibody therapies that can even touch them. That's where we're headed into right now. Also, I follow a lot of Canadian people somehow. There's it seems like more discussion in Canadian medical circles of COVID than in the US. Anyway, their hospitals are full. Their ERs are full. Their pediatric ICUs are full. And they're begging for the government to bring back masks. This is where we need political organizing for action, because real people's kids are, getting severely sick, and there's no space in the hospitals for them. That's the point we're at already. Anyway, where were we? Today, there are hundreds of Omicron strains, all with mutations that provide increased... Oh yeah, we read that. The scene differs depending on where you are. BA5 variants are still dominant in the US, according to GISAID data, while infections involving BQ variants are also rising. France's largest proportion of cases are also BA5 family members, but the strains that are dominant there differ slightly from those that are most common in the US. In Chile, stealth Omicron is still going strong, making up nearly 44% of cases, with descendants of itself and the original Omicron on its heels. And often locked down China is a different world altogether, with one of the original COVID strains accounting for 31% of cases. And again, they don't have nearly as many cases, followed by Delta at nearly 19%. Let's pause there. What's unique about China? They're one of the only countries that has really made strong efforts to keep COVID down. What do we see there? They don't have all these crazy mutations. They're still dealing with the much relatively easier to deal with early strain and Delta. So this is entirely human caused in terms of just letting the virus spread when we could have choked it off from spreading. And the vaccines are good for eliminating your personal risk of getting the worst outcomes if you get infected. But they don't really do anything for transmission, or not very much of anything for transmission. That's where masks and isolation and testing and all that stuff comes into play. All the stuff that we have stopped doing on a societal level. So like testing in schools, testing in workplaces on a weekly basis, isolation, quarantining, which of course needs support, paying people to stay home, targeted lockdowns as needed. That's sort of the last thing to cap a particularly bad outbreak for a week or so. But they've just totally thrown their hands up on all this, and this was part of I almost said Joe Biden's job. When he came in and said mask or vax, literally just 4 months into his presidency. That destroyed the collective response to COVID. So, compare. China has very early strains, and they're not dealing with all this highly mutated stuff. And you can see the difference. So behavior matters here. Continuing. The story of COVID is no longer, quote, one variant rising, doing its thing. We mitigate again. It comes back down. We brace for the next one, Gregory said. Things are coexisting at the same time, moving around. The longer they circulate, the more you get combinations. So that XBB, for example, what does the X mean? That means it's a recombinant strain. What's a recombinant strain? It means it has combined genetic material from multiple strains. It didn't just mutate itself. Somewhere in the replication process, the genetics from different viruses crossed. And so this can happen in a lab. You can make, lab-created recombinants. That's not the case here. It can also happen within the human body. So if you get infected with multiple strains, your body can create a recombinant strain of COVID, and we see that now. Not only are multiple viral families warring it out with different levels of success in different regions, but battles are occurring within families. In effect, relatives are fighting amongst themselves to lead lineages, Gregory says. Victories in turn. The extremely immune evasive BQ family will almost certainly become dominant in the U.S. in the coming weeks, according to multiple experts. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. or any other country with rising levels of BQ has dodged the other variants. XBB will likely fuel the following U.S. wave, then perhaps XBC, a Delta Omicron hybrid. Gregory and Raj Narayanan, Assistant Dean of Research and Associate Professor at the New York Institute of Technology campus in Jonesboro, Arkansas, tell Fortune. That could mean that the U.S. and other countries are in for a winter during which multiple viral families are briefly dominant before receding. There may not be one COVID peak in late 2022, but overlapping surges fueled by different variants that create a wide, ugly peak with a jagged top. Well, this isn't a crazy prediction because that's exactly what we've seen so far. Let me put it on the screen. Some of you will have seen this many times already. This is from a month ago, so I haven't updated it in a while. But that's exactly, if you look over on the right side, that's what we've had. It's a plateau with a couple of peaks. Overall, you have a basic average level of COVID, and that's exactly what they're saying may continue through the winter. Anyway, prior to this summer's BA5 surge, COVID was in a constant predator-prey cycle, according to Gregory. Those days are gone. It's an ecology now, Gregory said. It was how many rabbits and how many wolves. Now it's a whole ecosystem. That's the end of that article. So we're just into a new phase of COVID entirely. It's not safer. It's not any less dangerous. It is just mutating to the point where there's multiple families of the virus fighting with each other for dominance. So I thought I had another COVID article here. Let me just take a second to look at this. Also, some days, when you're trying to read, you get a dry mouth. I, for whatever reason, have like the exact opposite problem, and I'm having to swallow like much more than usual. But in case you cared, for some that'll be TMI, but I go through a lot. Okay, I go through a lot to bring you these streams. No, I guess I didn't have. Could have sworn I had another one. Oh well. If I find it, maybe it'll go into tomorrow's stream. Not that big of a deal. All right. Let us go in. I'll go back into the chat for a minute. We will just put the other screen up. Actually, you know what? Let's thank the patrons. Take a brief intermission here. Thank you to the patrons whose names are on the screen. Patreon.com/socialismforall is where you can get your name on the screen. I appreciate these a lot. I've been struggling a little bit this month. You may have noticed that there aren't as many audiobooks going up. I've been doing a lot of streams. And in fact, the streams have almost been taking up too much of my time because it takes a lot of, many hours of prep time to look for news, to go through all the links that people send me, to screenshot them, to try to work them into some strategy, to try to see how do they link up with earlier strains of research that we've been doing and keep that going. I'm really having to limit myself to the 2 streams a week, and even then, I feel like I have to do 2 streams because 1 is never enough, but to a certain extent, it's kind of eating into the audiobook time. I also am just a bit busier recently in other areas of my life, so I apologize to people who really love the audiobooks and haven't been seeing as many of them. It's not like I'm not doing it anymore. I definitely am. But as I've been sort of improving my streaming game, that has been taking up most of the time. I know a lot of people do like the streams, but it is a change, and I always wonder how it's going over with people. But anyway, thanks to the patrons who, I would make content even if nobody paid. I wouldn't be able to spend nearly this much time on it, so their support really helps with the quantity of information being put up on the channel and the number of hours in a week that I can spend on this. So much appreciated. Also, remember to like, share, subscribe, whether you're a patron or not, because that will help YouTube to recommend this content to more people. And we did just cross 11,000 subscribers without stooping to any kind of opportunist fucking garbage. So it can be done. You can build an actual communist channel and engage in consistent agitation, education, and encouraging people to do organizing. That's not something I am deluded enough to think can happen through the internet, but I encourage people to join this regularly. Let me just add, when I started doing this in early 2020, there was kind of more going on. You had sort of the Bernie Sanders thing. Yeah, there's a lot of sock dems in that, but a lot of people became actual Marxists through that because Bernie was talking about socialism, and then they were like, hey, I know that there's this real socialism thing that Bernie may or may not be talking about. Let me go find out what that's about. I know that some of those people came into the S4A audience and were in the early S4A audience on Facebook and on YouTube. We're no longer on Facebook, by the way. So that's a real thing that happened. And then within months, we had an explosion of protests in the streets, and the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests, and that was sustained for months. There was a lot of really encouraging stuff happening that year. And it's, of course, Biden got in, and we've fallen back into life under, not a lot of even progressive, let alone socialist momentum. A lot of very reactionary stuff going on as the, conservative Democrats and the even more conservative into, overtly, foaming at the mouth fascist Republican, and some of the Democrats as well, take the stage. And, just to clarify on that, regardless of whether one party appears to be, slightly less crazy than the others, they're one system and they have to be addressed really as one system. So the Democrats collaborate with the Republicans. They're not anti-fascist. Supporting them, unfortunately, is not really an anti-fascist position. And unless we create something better than the Democrats to fight both parties, this is going to go around and around forever because they do work hand in glove, good cop, bad cop, and etc. That said, I mean, the Republican Party does house the more overtly reactionary faction on most issues, but again, the Democrats are right there working with them and defending them against the left. So that's like kind of their job, is to help suppress the left as well, because they're both funded by basically the same interests. Anyway, I don't even know what the hell I was talking about at this point. But given that we're just coming out of an election, it is important to clarify that. So anyway, let me take a sip here and we'll get back into the chat for a minute before we do some housing articles. And that'll probably be today's stream. All right, clearing the throat. Now, where were we in the chat? So, talking about the process before about undoing people's racism and sexism and fascism generally. Somebody says, I learned pretty good anti-racist and anti-homophobic, anti-sexist education young because of my older queen siblings, but the unconscious bias is real. We all have a bourgeois bias you should be aware of while undergoing anti-fascist deprogramming. This is part of why I was shocked to see that, quote, Marxists could be chauvinists. I was just kind of surprised at the extent of it, but yeah, I agree. And there's a comment in reply to that that says it's not easy to completely invert your worldview. It's also not like a binary state where you're either not Marxist or Marxist. You have to gradually peel away the layers, but I think you have to start from class consciousness, as that foundation makes it easier to understand other social matters, hierarchies, etc. It can take a while. It took a while for me. Even after I had made some progress, the libertarians are out there in force. And, for me, this was kind of done a while ago. I went through a lot of this in the 2000s. Part of, during the time, part of it was before there even was a YouTube. And a lot of the dynamics were the same then. This sort of left-right alliance, the progressive libertarian proposed alliance. Really, this only benefits libertarians because it makes worse progressives and stronger libertarians. So that's what it does. When I was sick with COVID-19, I wore an N95 mask to contain my droplets and protect me from infecting my father. Yeah, it'll contain your droplets and your aerosol particles, so that's good. And yeah, reminder, the mask is both for you to not pick up other people's shit, and it's also to protect them. If anybody ever gives you a hard time with the mask, just be like, this is for you as well. So anyway, if I, an infected person, can wear a tight-fitting mask, there's no excuse that anti-mask nutjobs have to say that I can't wear a mask. Well, and this is also, a lot of the anti-mask people tends to overlap with sort of, any kind of COVID minimization or denial, anywhere from, oh, it's not that bad anymore to, COVID was never real or something like that. But there tends to be a lot of overlap. Yeah, there's no real reason, but that doesn't necessarily matter. Reason is not necessarily what's guiding it. Yeah, mask indoors and outdoors makes sense. You can be not wearing one outdoors. And then you never know when somebody's going to get in your space. So, yeah. I don't see anyone wearing masks anymore in my area. It seems like COVID numbers are quite low around here, though. That's because they're not counting cases anymore. So, I don't know if you can go on biobot.io, biobot.io, and look up your county, not all county. Actually, I've been meaning to do sort of a county by county highlighting, because different counties around the United States, if you look at the wastewater, are doing completely different things. Some are spiking, some are plummeting, and they don't stay. Oh, you're not in the U.S. Okay, but if you can find wastewater data, so they still track cases in Alberta, but do you have rapid tests? That's my question. We're no longer. I mean, they, quote, track cases in the USA, in that if you get a PCR test, it gets reported. the thing is nobody's getting PCR tests. They're doing rapid tests, and people are not being tested on a routine basis as part of school requirements or work requirements. So the number of tests has gone way, way, way down from 2020 or even 2021. So when I say they're not counting cases anymore, it's because they're not doing the reported tests on any, any kind of the basis that it was. Yeah, and that's fair. I'm not expecting you to know all that, but I'm telling you, do not trust those case numbers because they're they're not counting the rapid tests and stuff like that. So yeah, yes, be the person that sets the example with masking, not the follower that eschews them. So yeah, it can seem like the COVID numbers are quite low, but look at your wastewater. That's going to be a much more telling thing. And it does come and it goes, but on the whole, there's still a significant outbreak. You just went to get milk today, which was the first time in 3 weeks. Well, I hope you weren't still drinking the last milk. That's a joke. All right. Anyway, let us get back into the next thing, which is a little bit of housing crisis. This is another thing I love to cover that almost no one is talking about. Definitely nobody in either the Democratic Party or Republican Party. Housing crisis. Is anybody talking about it? The extent you'll hear about it is Republicans, like in California, Michael Schellenberger, trying to reinstitutionalize the homeless people, whether or not they actually have any kind of suitable problem, just to sort of do street sweeps and so that he, as a rich person, doesn't have to look at homeless people who are completely fucked over by capitalism. It's about the most you'll hear about it at all. So anyway, here is from Fortune. This is from like about 9 days ago. The U.S. housing market to see second biggest correction of the post-World War II era. When to expect the home price bottom. So first of all, I'm not even slightly concerned about prices falling. In fact, we've needed this to happen. Prices have been climbing for no good reason for the last 5 or 6 years to where they're now completely unaffordable. That plus they're tightening mortgage rates, so the mortgages are much more expensive to get. So not only are you going to pay more on the baseline price of the house, you're going to pay much more in interest on the mortgage that you take out to afford that price. So you're going to wind up paying like $300,000 more than you should be between the price and the interest. Part of the reason that they'll probably get into why the housing prices are going to start coming down, it's not because they're building tons more houses. They're not. They should, but they're not. It's because the few people in the game of musical chairs that is money in capitalism during times of crisis have been buying up lots of properties, turning them into Airbnbs, things like that. Corporations have just been straight out buying up single-family houses to rent them out, stuff like that. We're in just shockingly predatory state of the housing situation right now. Anyway, people who were snatching up properties and hoarding them for profit, it's now more expensive for them to take out mortgages due to the raising interest rates. So they're not buying them as much, so the houses aren't being snapped up quite as quickly. So that's part of it. The problem is people, like the average person who just needs a house for use to live in it, still can't, still is getting screwed in this deal. So when I say, neither major party is doing anything about this, this is a basic need that affects every other basic needs, housing. If you do not have housing, cooking food, cleaning yourself, storing your clothing in a safe and dry place, on and on, all of that becomes so much more difficult, as does holding down a job. But 50% of people who don't have a house, don't have a home at all, live in a tent, etc., do work. So, I mean, that's the situation we have in the United States. Anyway, this is by Lance Lambert. Home builders, I hate it when they say home builders. It's a house. Call it a house. House builders and economists alike saw the 2000s housing bubble brewing. They just didn't think it would burst. Their reasoning being that at the time, home prices, again, okay, I got to be more on guard here. House prices hadn't really fallen since the Great Depression era. So let's just break that down a little bit. During the 2000s, there was a housing bubble. Prices were going up and up. They just never thought it would burst because it hadn't since the Great Depression. So, like, not since the 1930s had house prices really fallen. Therefore, they never will again. This is the kind of thinking, when I say that it took 2008 and the global financial meltdown for people to start talking about capitalism again, people really thought in the 2000s that somehow capitalism was fixed and it wasn't going to be unstable anymore. No, it's inherently unstable. It has booms and busts and all of the stuff that has been described since the very beginning. It's part of its basic nature, but a lot of people allowed themselves to drink the Kool-Aid and let themselves become convinced that somehow they had fixed the system. Well, 2008 blew that into smithereens. So anyway, quote, I think that the religion people had from 1946 to 2008, that housing prices always go up, is dead. My parents believed that it was literally inconceivable for house prices to go down. Redfin CEO Glenn Kelman tells Fortune. By the way, Redfin, that's one of these online algorithm things that is involved in manipulating the market. We're going to read an article about the rental market that breaks down exactly how an algorithm has been completely fucking with and driving up rent. That religion, of course, came crashing down after the bursting housing bubble caused U.S. house prices to fall a staggering 27% from 2006 to 2012. Knowing that house prices can indeed fall, Kelman says, is why builders and flippers started cutting prices faster this time around. Once the market shifted, they wanted to get out first and not be holding a bunch of houses. Quote, folks are responding in 2022 to that with almost PTSD, and they pull back much more quickly, Kelman says. As of August, the lagged Case-Shiller Index, in relation to LaRouche, showed that U.S. house prices had fallen 1.3% from their June 2022 peak. Of course, they're insanely high, so that's not going to do much, but the fact that it's falling is significant. That marks the first decline since 2012. It's also likely well below the actual drop. Just look at the 7.6% decline in third quarter U.S. house equity as reported on Friday by Black Knight. That's the biggest house equity drop, $1.3 trillion, ever recorded. And the biggest percentage drop since 2009. Is 2009 a significant year? Yeah, global financial meltdown. Just how far will house prices fall? It depends on who you ask. Researchers at Goldman Sachs expect U.S. house prices to decline between 5 to 10% from peak to trough, with their official forecast model predicting a 7.6% drop. If it comes to fruition, it would surpass the 2.2% decline between May 1990 and April 1991. That would make this ongoing correction the second biggest house price decline of the post-World War II era. Quote, economists at Goldman Sachs Research say that there are risks that housing markets could decline more than their model suggests. That's just what I was thinking. Are they possibly trying to avoid panic here? Yeah. Based on signals from house price momentum and housing affordability, writes Goldman Sachs on its website. So this is their model. They're highlighting, though, that there are risks that it could decline much more. That said, it could take a while for house prices to reach the bottom. In fact, the Goldman Sachs model estimates that U.S. house prices won't get to that point until March 2024. We'll take this with a grain of salt because these were the same people telling us right up to 2008 that everything was fine. So here's a map. This shows the degree to which regional house prices are either overvalued or undervalued in 2022, according to Moody's Analytics. Now you can see that the blue color, the bluish green color, is if it's undervalued. You can see there's very few counties. There's one in California, there's one in Illinois, there's one in, I think that's Missouri. There's, a couple of other ones, one in Pennsylvania, one in Alaska, like in the middle of Alaska, that's maybe a little bit undervalued. The overwhelming majority of these are purple and black, meaning moderately to severely overvalued. The black is 25% overvalued and up. That would be half the state of Florida, lots of the Southwest, lots of like the Carolinas, and so on. So mostly houses are dramatically overvalued. So anyway, continuing, researchers at Moody's Analytics are a bit more bearish. Yeah, I think so. It forecasts a 10% peak to trough U.S. house price decline, with prices bottoming out in late 2025. However, if a recession hits, they would expect a bigger 15 to 20% peak to trough decline. I think all of these are intended to calm people. I think it would be much worse than this. I also think it would hit much faster. Like, they're not trying to tell people, oh, there's going to be a big crash, but because that's not good for anybody. People will start pulling their money out of all their investments and stuff. But that's entirely possible. So, keep that in mind. They're really gearing this. Those are pretty, strong predictions of declines. I think that the lesson after 2008 was they know that capitalism has ups and downs, but they're trying. I think that the big effort is they're trying not to have it be like a catastrophic Great Depression 2008 type crash or meltdown. I think that they're trying to set up the padding so that, it has a slower effect and it doesn't quite wind up with such destructive effects. That said, if you fall out of an airplane at like 20,000 feet, all the padding in the world stacked underneath is, unless you've literally got 20,000 feet worth of padding, it's not going to do a fucking thing. So anyway, of course, when groups say U.S. house prices, they're talking about a national aggregate. Regionally, researchers acknowledge that shifts in house prices vary significantly by market. In bubbly markets like Boise and Nashville, Moody's forecasts a decline of around 20%. Meanwhile, in Chicago, a relatively tame market during the boom, it expects a house price decline of less than 3.6%. You can find their forecast for 322 markets at that link. So why are house prices already starting to roll over? It boils down to what Fortune calls pressurized affordability. There's a term. Spiked mortgage rates, coupled with a historic 43% jump in U.S. house prices during the pandemic housing boom. Again, that should not be a thing, but people had to sell off a bunch of stuff at the beginning of the pandemic, and then people who were already pretty rich bought it. This is so sickening. This should just not be treated as a commodity in the first place. So that has simply put monthly payments beyond what many would-be borrowers can afford. So let's say that again. This is pretty much what I was saying before. The baseline prices are 43% higher, and that's just during the pandemic boom. It was climbing even prior to the pandemic. And the spiking mortgage rates. Those combined have simply put monthly payments beyond what many would-be borrowers can afford. So we can say many would-be borrowers. Who are a lot of those borrowers? People who need fucking houses. That's what we're talking about here in the end. When all is said and done, Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi thinks that this ongoing housing correction or price drop will push national housing fundamentals back in line with historic norms. Well, I'm sure he's saying that with fingers crossed. There's a good amount of wishful thinking here. When statements about economics and politics are made in the media, it's as much, the objective results of their analysis as it is trying to sort of hocus pocus stuff into existence. If they put the message out there in the media and get people to believe it, then people will sort of act in line with that, and maybe that change in behavior will work to the favor of the spellcaster here. Quote, before prices began to decline, we were overvalued nationally by around 25%. Now this means prices will normalize. Affordability will be restored. The housing market won't be overvalued after this process is over, Zandi says. Well, is that really the case, or are there other factors that he is just conveniently excluding from the analysis? Prices will normalize. Well, again, not a, you have big institutional buyers who continue to just pay. Like, so the interest rates just went up. So that cut certain people out of the market. People who aren't sitting on like billions of dollars and, where maybe they've bought 5 or 10 Airbnb properties, but okay, they can't buy that 11th one because they just ran out of money. They had like a couple $1 million, whatever. But yeah, we'll see how this actually plays out because there really may be other factors. All right, kind of along the same lines. Oh, that's where my other COVID article went. Well, we'll do that tomorrow. That's funny. It got bundled up with the another thing I saved under rent. All right, anyway. So this is from ProPublica. This is kind of a long article, so we'll just get through it as quickly as we can. The title is Rent Going Up. One Company's Algorithm Could Be Wise by Heather Vogel, ProPublica, with data analysis by Haru Koren, ProPublica, and Ryan Little. This is from about a month ago, October 15. So again, long article, but very instructive about what's happening. Texas-based RealPage's YieldStar software. So let's just break that down. Company based in Texas called RealPage. They have software called YieldStar. What does it do? It helps landlords set prices for apartments across the U.S. With rents soaring, critics are concerned that the company's proprietary algorithm is hurting competition. On a summer day last fall, a group of real estate tech executives gathered at a conference hall in Nashville to boast about one of their company's signature products, software that uses a mysterious algorithm to help landlords push the highest possible rents on tenants. Quote, "Never before have we seen these numbers," said Jay Parsons, a vice president of RealPage, as convention goers wandered by. Apartment rents had recently shot up by as much as 14.5%, he said in a video touting the company's services. Turning to his colleague, Parsons asked, what role had the software played? Quote, "I think it's driving it, quite honestly," answered Andrew Bowen, another RealPage executive. As a property manager, very few of us would be willing to actually raise rents double digits within a single month by doing it manually. The celebratory remarks were more than swagger. I just have to pause here for a minute. What a disgusting thing this is. So this is exclusively, when we talk about the interests of the capitalists are diametrically opposed to the interests of the proletarians. And again, what is a proletarian? Somebody who doesn't own capital. The only commodity we have to sell is our labor. That's why we end up as the working class. Not everybody can work. People have various disabilities and things like that. But the basic thing that makes us proletarians is we don't own capital. So that's the basic thing here, and definitely not enough to live off of. But yeah, this is helping people who own apartments, and it is directly hurting people who don't. There's nothing about improvements to the property, nothing like that. It's just like, hey, can you manipulate the market to get more money? That's what they're doing. Continuing. The celebratory remarks were more than swagger. For years, RealPage has sold software that uses data analytics to suggest daily prices for open units. Property managers across the United States have gushed about how the company's algorithm boosts profits. Quote, "The beauty of YieldStar is that it pushes you to places that you wouldn't have gone if you weren't using it," said Courtney Ballas, Director of Revenue Management at JVM Realty, referring to RealPage's software in a testimonial video on the company's website. So it's literally, as you will see in this article, convincing landlords to raise rents far beyond what they would have done on their own. So it's directly accelerating increases in rents. The nation's largest property management firm, Greystar, found that even in one downturn, its buildings using YieldStar, quote, outperformed their markets by almost 5%, a significant premium above competitors, RealPage said in materials on its website. Greystar uses RealPage's software to price tens of thousands of apartments. RealPage became the nation's dominant provider of such rent-setting software after federal regulators approved a controversial merger in 2017, a ProPublica investigation found. This greatly expanded the company's influence over apartment prices. The move helped the Texas-based company to push the client base for its array of real estate tech services past 31,700 customers. So they've almost got 32,000 landlords using this software, and that covers like a huge amount of rental markets. The impact is stark in some markets. In one neighborhood in Seattle, ProPublica found 70% of apartments were overseen by just 10 property managers, every single one of which used pricing software sold by RealPage. So again, for tenants trying to negotiate their rent, these people are just going to be like, fuck you, the computer told me this, pay it or I'll find somebody who will. So it's like now the landlords are just marching to the tune of the software. And that's it, like end of story. So anyway, to arrive at a recommended rent, the software deploys an algorithm, a set of mathematical rules, to analyze a trove of data that RealPage gathers from clients, including private information and what nearby competitors charge. For tenants, the system upends the practice, this is what I was just saying, of negotiating with apartment building staff. RealPage discourages bargaining with renters and has even recommended that landlords in some cases accept a lower occupancy rate in order to raise rents and make more money. So this is the same thing with are workers demanding better wages? Just run your company at, don't hire. Run your company at lower output for a while, and that way you can beat back the demands for higher wages, or in this case, lower rents. Again, diametrically opposed. The landlord wants you to pay more per month. You want to pay less per month. And so this is going to take some very serious organizing to get around this, or to be able to combat it, not to get around it, but to confront it. But you know what I mean, to get around the effects of this. One of the algorithm's developers told ProPublica that leasing agents had, quote, too much empathy compared to computer-generated pricing. Are we going to have like a version of that movie War Games, but instead of firing nuclear weapons, it's just kicking people out on the streets internally? Turn your key, sir. Anyway, apartment managers can reject the software's suggestions, but as many as 90% are adopted, according to former RealPage employees. The software's design and growing reach have raised questions among real estate and legal experts about whether RealPage has birthed a new kind of cartel that allows the nation's largest landlords to indirectly coordinate pricing, potentially in violation of federal law. Very good question. Experts say that RealPage and its clients invite scrutiny from antitrust enforcers for several reasons, including their use of private data on what competitors charge and rent. In particular, RealPage's creation of work groups that meet privately and include landlords who are otherwise rivals could be a red flag of potential collusion, a former federal prosecutor said. At a minimum, critics said, the software's algorithm may be artificially inflating rents and stifling competition. Quote, machines quickly learn the only way to win is to push prices above competitive levels, said University of Tennessee law professor Maurice Stuck, a former prosecutor in the Justice Department's antitrust division. So what does that mean, pushing prices above competitive levels? So basically the way that rents are is you have a competitive range that basically people will not, renters will not pay above that. They will move. What they're finding is, well, if everybody raises it higher, that would be the collusion part, then you're not giving the tenants lower rent options. And that's what's happening here. RealPage acknowledged that it feeds its clients' internal rent data into its pricing software, giving landlords an aggregated, anonymous look at what their competitors nearby are charging. A company representative said in an email that RealPage, quote, uses aggregated market data from a variety of sources in a legally compliant manner. Well, of course they're going to say that. The company noted that landlords who use employees to manually set prices, quote, typically conduct phone surveys to check competitors' rents, which the company says could result in anti-competitive behavior. Quote, RealPage's revenue management solutions prioritize a property's own internal supply and demand dynamics over external factors such as competitors' rents, a company statement said, and therefore help eliminate the risk of collusion that could occur with manual pricing. So what is it? Suddenly just everybody starts using the software and boom, miraculously rents are 15% higher? Nowhere is it causing people to lower the rents anywhere. It's always going higher. Interesting. The statement said that RealPage's software also prevents rents from reaching unaffordable levels because it detects drops in demand. Okay, but you're just telling them to run apartments at less occupancy. So that would be reflective of you're doing unaffordable levels. So anyway, like those that happen seasonally and can respond to them by lowering rents. But again, what's the overall trend? RealPage did not make Parsons, Bowen, or the company's current CEO, Dana Jones, available for interviews. Of course, Ballas and a Greystar representative declined to comment on the record about YieldStar. If you have nothing to hide, why are you hiding everything? The National Multifamily Housing Council, an industry group, also declined to comment. Now, it's not unusual for people to decline to comment, but you have to weigh that as a listener against the fact that they've got all this company PR. If it really stacked up, probably they could answer a few more questions about it, but they're declining, they're pleading the fifth. Fine, that's their right, but maybe it's that the PR statements that they put out is not as accurate as it could be. The National Multifamily Housing Council, an industry group, also declined to comment. Proponents say that the software is not distorting the market. RealPage's CEO told investors 5 years ago that the company wouldn't be big enough to harm competition even after the merger. I mean, could they have just been wrong? The CEO of one of YieldStar's earliest users, Rick Campo of Camden Property Trust, told ProPublica that the apartment market in his company's home city alone is so big and diverse that, quote, it would be hard to argue that there was some kind of price fixing. Okay, until everyone starts using it, though. So, I mean, isn't that like their business model is getting a lot of people using it, right? Because if they don't, somebody else is going to come along and they're going to get more customers and then they're going to put them out of business. So, of course, they need to keep expanding. What role RealPage's software has played in soaring rents, which in the decade before the pandemic nearly doubled in some cities? So this is what I've been saying is, I personally, and I've commented on this many times on the channel, I had a situation where I didn't like where I was living and I wanted to get out of there. I hadn't sort of moved in a while. And holy fuck, it was like the rents were just literally double for absolute fucking garbage. And I was like, okay, so I guess gone are the days where you can just move around. And striking. But yeah, it was exactly that time. The decade before the pandemic, rents have like doubled in a lot of places. It's hard to discern. Inadequate new construction and the tight market for home buyers, house buyers, have exacerbated an existing housing shortage. Great. So again, is there something we can do politically about this? Of course there is. Are they even talking about it? No. Who's the number 4 contributor to both the Democratic and Republican parties? Real estate people. So, if we don't build something of our own to fight and struggle in many different ways, you can expect more of this. Expect it to get worse, period. And as I was saying before, the year that I started this, there was kind of a lot going on in 2020. It made me very excited to do this channel. I have to say, while I'm very interested in keeping the torch burning from sort of historical moment to historical moment, it gets a bit harder to maintain that enthusiasm for doing this channel when the movement is not necessarily making the strides that it should be making. It's kind of like, why should I throw up another audiobook on the channel when people, clearly haven't even read the fucking hundreds that I did do, and it's not being, even if they have, it's not being applied into like real world action. That's the point of this. It's not so you can like win arguments online. It's so we can learn and have better politics and then actually make changes in the real world. That's the whole fucking point of Socialism for All. Anyway, continuing, but by RealPage's own admission, its algorithm is helping to drive rents higher. Quote, find out how YieldStar can help you outperform the market 3 to 7%. RealPage urges potential clients on its website. Few tenants know that such software, owned by a privately held company, has had a hand in rent increases across the country. So again, let's just pause, do a little bit of just, simple logical thinking. If RealPage is urging people to become a customer and then outperform the market 3 to 7%, what does that mean? It means get more money for your shit. What does that mean if not driving rents higher? So they're like, oh yeah, we haven't had a role in that. Hold on a second. Hey, you landlord, do you want to get more money for your apartment? I'm pretty sure that that means raising the rent. Anyway, in Boston, renter Kaylee Hutchinson said she was puzzled when her landlord, unbeknownst to her, a RealPage client, told her days into the first pandemic lockdowns that her rent was going up. Building staff insisted that the market rate for her apartment was 6.5% higher than she was paying, despite her protests that people were fleeing the city. A few weeks later, she and her fiance saw a newly vacant unit in their building advertised online for less than they were paying. One of their landlord's policies permitted moving to another unit owned by the company, so they did. Hutchinson, who is an analyst for the police department, wondered if a computer algorithm was behind the building staff's inflexibility. Quote, it was pretty obvious that they should have been dropping prices, but instead they were digging their heels in. Hutchinson said that she watched apartments in her building sit vacant at prices that didn't make sense to her. Quote, a normal mom-and-pop landlord, they're worried about having a good tenant and protecting their interest in the agreement. These companies, they'll just replace you. The origins of YieldStar. One of YieldStar's main architects was a business executive who had personal experience with antitrust prosecution. A genial, self-described numbers nerd, Jeffrey Roper was Alaska Airlines Director of Revenue Management when it and other major airlines began developing price-setting software in the 1980s. Competing airlines began using common software to share planned routes and prices with each other before they went public. The technology helped head off price wars that would have lowered ticket prices, the Department of Justice said. The department said that the arrangement may have artificially inflated airfares, estimating the cost to consumers at more than $1 billion between 1988 and 92. The government eventually reached settlements or consent decrees for price fixing with 8 airlines, including Alaska Airlines, all of which agreed to change how they used the technology. At one point, federal agents removed a computer and documents from Roper's office at the airline. He said that he and other creators of the software weren't aware of the antitrust implications. Quote, we all got called up before the Department of Justice in the early 1980s because we were colluding. We had no idea. Well, so he says. When Roper returned to the United States in the early 2000s after a stint in Central and Eastern Europe, he said he discovered the apartment rental industry was so far behind technologically that it resembled the emerging markets he'd just left. Apartment managers were, quote, basically pricing their product on a paper napkin, said Roper, who eventually formed his own company. Old computers and manual record keeping were mainstays of the industry. Leasing agents gauged how their buildings compared by calling up competitors. Quote, this was just a ripe business with lots of money and lots of opportunities for technological improvement, Roper said. So again, the question here is like, could people afford them? And was there a need to, comparing them to like the emerging markets in Central and Eastern Europe? Well, it isn't that. We've had markets like this for a very long time in the United States. And, even then, sometimes there'd be unaffordable things or whatever. But again, we're talking about housing. Was there a need to squeeze people, renters, absolutely as hard as possible for this basic necessity? And again, this guy seems to think so, and so he's going to go to work creating the same kind of product that, the first time around you can say, oh, I didn't know it was collusion. Then you go do the same fucking thing again. Yeah. Anyway, RealPage hired Roper as its principal scientist in 2004 to improve software it had bought from Camden Property Trust, a large investor-backed owner and manager of apartment buildings. Roper quickly realized he required data, a lot of data, to get the algorithm working properly. He began building a, quote, master data warehouse that pulled in client data from other RealPage applications, such as those for leasing managers. A proof-of-concept version of the software had performed well in tests at townhouses that Camden offered for rent in its home city of Houston. At the same time, the street behind Camden's townhouses was shut down while a grocery store was being built. Leasing staff wanted to discount rent for the townhouses because of the nuisance, which makes sense, said Kip Zacharias, who worked with Camden as a consultant. Instead, YieldStar suggested boosting rents, We were like, guys, just try it, Zacharias said. Fuck the tenants, right? The units ended up renting for significantly more than staff had expected, he said. Yeah, almost like people need fucking housing. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a finite amount of housing and you are just fucking with people. Quote, that was kind of the eureka moment, Zacharias said. If you'd listened to your gut, you would have lowered the price. Because people need to live somewhere. Like, do you get that? It's sick. Anyway, the practice of lowering rent to fill a vacancy was a reflex for many in the apartment industry. Letting units sit empty could be costly and nerve-wracking for leasing agents. Such agents sometimes hesitated to push rents higher. Roper said, I mean, can I just say, I've seen this myself. I've seen apartments that I went and checked out, and they were absolute shitholes. Like absolute shitholes, inconveniently located, bad amenities, mold, whatever. They're being listed for like $400 more than I would have even considered remotely reasonable. And then you check back on the listing and they've like put it higher. And I know that this is costing them money because in one case, there was something where, I had inquired if they would be willing to drop the price 10%, which would have brought it into a range where it would have been like thinkable to take it. And I was really wanting to, pursue it. Not specifically that place, but it was one of the only decent places that didn't have like mold and all kinds of other shit. But they were asking way too much money for it. And I was like, look, will you drop it 10%? And they refused. And then I saw the thing still sitting there empty 3 months, 4 months later. And I wrote to them and I was like, if you had rented to me at the price I had requested, you would have made more money than your stupid apartment sitting empty. Even if it rents at the higher rate, you'd have to rent for significantly longer to make up for that. Plus, I'm a good tenant. Like, it could have been potentially like a multi-year situation, etc. So this isn't always like, they're making sort of a game out of like getting the highest price per thing. I don't know that it is helping them overall. So, but it is fucking over tenants. I can tell you that much. Because end result, I didn't get the apartment. I wasn't able to change my situation. So it's holding everything up in the economy. When people can't move to different areas to like pursue work, to do whatever, to be closer to family, like whatever it is, to get away from family, like as the case may be, it's just holding everything up. And so now this whole market is falling into the hands of this algorithm. And like, this is uncharted territory, but so far the results have been not good. Anyway, unimpeded by human worries, YieldStar's price increases sometimes led to more tenants leaving. Wow, what a shocker. Camden's turnover rates increased about 15 percentage points in 2006 after it implemented YieldStar. Campo, the company's CEO, told a trade publication a few years later. But that wasn't a problem for the firm. Despite having to replace more renters, its revenue grew by 7.4%. So, but their turnover increased 15 percentage points. So does this have problems for, society at all? People who weren't able to, like, let's say, find new housing in the same area would have had to leave their job. That leads to disruptions in the economy, etc. And, so this is not really good for anybody but the parasitic landlord company. Quote, the net effect of driving revenue and pushing people out was $10 million in income, Campo said. I think that shows keeping heads in the beds above all else is not always the best strategy. You know what else I've heard actually really works is if you lock people up and then make them work for you for like 50 cents an hour, you can get things made at 50 cents an hour. There's a reason that that's not, become the dominant system in society, though. It's called fucking slavery. So, how much more is the rental market going to shift, which I believe houses about 2/3 of the people in the United States. I think only about 1/3 of people own a house and everybody else rents. So you're literally talking about the overwhelming majority of society here being squeezed by this algorithm. What's it going to do 5 or 10 years from now? So there's this shithead right there. Reminded of that quote, Campo told ProPublica that it, quote, sounds awful. Yeah, because it is awful, dipshit, and it doesn't reflect how he or Camden views renters today. No, materially, that's how you treat people. Quote, we fundamentally believe our customers are the most important part of the business, he said. We're not about pushing people out. Yeah, but that is what you do. That is what you do. And your customers are now landlords, not renters. And landlords have diametrically opposed interests to the renters. So who are you for? You're for the parasitical small class of landlords over the overwhelming majority of society. Hiking rents at the same time benefited all landlords, the industry learned. A rising tide lifts all boats, one real estate executive and revenue management proponent told the industry publication Yield Pro in 2007. You're describing collusion. That's what you're describing. All right? And, they use the phrase a rising tide lifts all boats to try to, say like, oh, prosperity in capitalism leads to just universal prosperity. No. We have, I have a graphic for specifically this purpose, which of course I'm not going to be able to bring up because, there we go. Remember this thing called class? Things in capitalism do not benefit all classes equally. So they're serving one class at the expense of other classes. And that's actually how this works. So you can say, we're for our customers. But if your customers are landlords, this rising tide lifting all boats, only landlords have the fucking boats in this case. Other people are just drowning. So anyway, where were we? I think we're on the previous screen. One of the greatest threats to a landlord's profit, according to Roper and other executives, was other firms setting rents too low at nearby properties. If you have idiots undervaluing, it costs the whole system. But again, maybe they just don't need to charge any more than that, and maybe they, for whatever reason, have a belief in, like that's the place is paid off, and they only want to make a certain amount on it, and they're not out to it's in their interest in a certain sense to extort their renters for every last penny that they can squeeze out of them. But maybe they have some actual humanity and they just don't need to do that. Maybe they just want to make $200 a month on it, and for whatever reason that's enough for them. Maybe they're reluctant landlords in the first place and they're not looking to get into this sleazy sort of let a computer set it and fuck the human heart basically. But so this is how he's referring to people who price it any lower than the absolute maximum. Idiots. Roper wasn't the only technologist. And again, yet another reason for more people in STEM to be learning something about social science is this kind of, shit. Roper wasn't the only technologist working on an apartment pricing algorithm. Donald Davidoff, the primary developer of rival software called Lease Rent Options, or LRO, said that he designed his program differently to head off any concerns about collusion. Instead of relying on a digital warehouse that includes competitor data, Davidoff used a complex formula and public market data, not private market data, to steer LRO's algorithm. The system relied on incremental price shifts to manage demand for apartments, said Davidoff, an MIT-educated former rocket engineer. Quote, that's not dissimilar to changing a trajectory of a rocket through the inflection of a nozzle, he said, making small changes that can dramatically alter something's course over time. And we might add, potentially, when changes in wages and things like that might be able to keep up with it. What we have right now is rents and house prices shooting up at a time where pay is not even coming close. And so people are getting caught in the middle on a vital need, housing. Davidoff said that he was careful to avoid features that might run counter not only to anti-discrimination laws such as the Fair Housing Act, but also those that bar competitors from conspiring to set prices. Quote, I had many conversations with attorneys to understand where the boundaries are, he said. Anyone who's building one of these systems or is involved in these should care a lot about fair housing. Doesn't sound like it. And should care a lot about price collusion to avoid both. Roper told ProPublica that when he was developing the YieldStar software more than a decade ago, he was concerned about avoiding both issues. He also said he didn't want to misuse private data in pricing. I was highly sensitized to, you just don't do it, Roper said. Okay, except that is what you're doing, though, now. Despite differences in the software's design, RealPage acquired LRO in 2017 after months of scrutiny. Oh, so this is the merger that they were talking about. RealPage acquired LRO in 2017 after months of scrutiny by the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. Federal regulators review mergers above a certain size. Right now, its transactions valued at $101 million. And typically, they allow them to proceed after only a preliminary review, but some are flagged for a more extensive look. The government can challenge a merger in court if it believes it could substantially harm competition. RealPage's purchase of LRO received such a second look, but the DOJ allowed it to proceed in late 2017. The department did not respond to requests for comment. Interesting. The approval allowed RealPage to acquire its only significant competitor, Roper said, adding, I was surprised that the DOJ let that go through. So this was again under Trump, so I don't know how many of the sort of MAGA appointees were involved in that, if this was a big shift or not, I don't know. But even the people doing it, so basically this is the less scrupulous company acquiring the software of the guy who was like, I'm concerned about non-discrimination in housing and making slow changes over time. The YieldStar company basically swallowed that one up. And they were surprised that the Department of Justice allowed it because it could have like apocalyptic changes on the rent, as you're seeing, crazy changes. Anyway, the approval allowed them to get it. RealPage was pricing 1.5 million units, and the acquisition of LRO would double that, pricing 3 million units. Steve Wynn, RealPage's then CEO, said at a mid-2017 investor conference, quote, I don't think there's any enough concentration of buying or pricing power here to warrant Department of Justice concerns, he said. A third company had a substantial footprint in the market, Wynn said, but property managers' own manual pricing processes or proprietary systems were RealPage's largest competitor. Quote, we expect our combined platform to drive accelerated, sustained revenue growth. How can you possibly, without building more units, how can you just sustain revenue growth? Just jacking up the rent over and over again. That's the only way. Yeah. Wynn said in a media release announcing the deal. RealPage's influence was burgeoning. That year, the firm's target market, multifamily buildings with 5 or more units, made up about 19 million of the nation's 45 million rental units. A growing share of those buildings were owned by firms backed by Wall Street investors, who were among the most eager adopters of pricing software. So, you get all these microtransactions like software and algorithms that place like 1,000, purchases and sales per second, some of them. And these are the people who are now getting into controlling whether or not you have a fucking roof over your head directly, not indirectly like, oh, I lost money in the stock market, should have picked better stocks. No, these companies are going to be owning the housing in this country that is available to renters. If we do not do organizing on this, again, people's beloved Democratic Party that says it's, quote, standing up to fascism, they're working hand in glove with this shit. And while the Democratic Party tends to attract less overtly fascist followers than the Republican Party does, and that is somewhat reflected in their messaging and things, they are part of this system. They're the reason why the Republicans are there. They're the reason that all this is happening. They are part of why we have this system that allows all this stuff in the first place. So, we discussed this, whether it's people talk about, vote Democrat for like trans rights or whatever. Why are trans rights in jeopardy in the first place? Even if you want to blame the entire thing on the Republicans, who are the Republicans' competition? Democrats. Why are they losing to these people? They run terrible campaigns and they collaborate on every major project of the U.S. empire and police state. Continuing. RealPage renamed its combined pricing software AI Revenue Management, By the end of 2020, the firm was reporting in a Securities and Exchange Commission filing that its clients used its services and products to manage almost 20 million rental units of all types, including single-family homes. The private equity firm Thoma Bravo bought the public company a few months later for $10.2 billion. Wynn, whose net worth Forbes estimates at $1.7 billion, stepped aside. He did not respond to requests for comment. So that's what you get for helping to destroy the rental market, $1.7 billion. A spokesperson for Thoma Bravo declined to comment. We're going to leave it there for today. I'm going to go back into the chat. We're going to wrap up. We're halfway through this article. It actually gets worse. So we're going to pick this up in tomorrow's stream. We're going to also talk about organizing the unemployed then too. But let's get this back up. Let's go into the stream, the chat stream, and see what's going on. Housing is a big issue in my city, and it's one of the main focuses of organizing efforts. That's very good. Give us some links. I'd love to help cover it. You know, things that work, people need to start doing them everywhere. The monsters making the bubble knew it was going to pop. Yeah, I mean, there's this idea that like, well, it hasn't popped since 1945. It's not going to now. I can see some people, I mean, that's literally before a lot of the people investing in that shit in the 2000s were even born. So, you know, you can see where they started drinking that Kool-Aid. But anyway, all bubbles pop. They only care about enjoying the ride and getting as much money as possible. Then when it pops, they're insulated by wealth and just move on to the next bubble. Yeah, most of them do. I went to Florida on vacation, and driving through it, I saw entire neighborhoods of Airbnb rentals. Right outside Orlando, they were ugly, fenced-in trailer parks that looked like they lack any form of AC. It was a really sad situation. Yeah, all the actual housing, you know, and if somebody wants to, like, you know, see, like, for me, I really like, you know, just, my living situation is really important. For some people, you know, they're barely home and, you know, they don't really care. And maybe like saving a lot of money and having a trailer, like that's fine for them. You know, it's gonna vary. But yeah, you're saying like all the actual houses got turned into Airbnbs that nobody can access for more than like, you know, a few weeks at a time for crazy prices. Meanwhile, the permanent residents are reduced to like some of the lower forms of housing that are even available. Isn't it kind of ironic that they're using an algorithm to set rent, kind of like equilibrium isn't a real thing? Yeah, well, that's what they're saying. It's like, you know, they want constant growth. What does that mean except for constantly raising the price? And probably far in excess. You know, is there some algorithm just raising wages somewhere? Like, obviously not. So they're going to raise rent to the absolute limit that people can afford at all, and then they're going to keep raising it. I mean, arguably we're there now. There's a lot of people who pay like 2/3 of their income in rent. You know, this is, I mean, when I say I don't know why people aren't out in the streets like now, like they were in 2022, I really mean it. I know that people are busy working and shit, but like the writing's on the wall as far as, you know, what's going to happen. We're not going to meekly get out of the situation. Algorithm is not collusion is such a brazen claim to make. It's fucking automated collusion, absolutely. It also lends support to the idea that computers can just manage the resources in an economy. Yeah, I mean, it lends support to that until it completely breaks. Talking about Allende was maybe planning to use computers. I mean, all, you know, any kind of socialist economy now is going to use computers. Literally everything uses computers. Most people carry around computers in their pocket called their phones. Like to have the computing power in a phone, that would have cost like billions of dollars in the 1970s. Like just, you know, 40 plus years ago, would have cost like billions of dollars. Everything's run by computers. Obviously, a socialist planned economy would extensively use computers, but not like this. Because socialism doesn't run on a profit basis, which is what this is all about. It runs on a, you know, for use to meet human need basis. Allende should have brutally purged Chile of reactionary elements. Not that it's his fault that the USA couped him. Yeah, but I mean that wasn't the model. In fact, we have 4 Allende speeches up on the channel, and it goes year by year. While he's running, accepting the win, a year into it, and then his final broadcast when the coup was happening. And you can see, after they won democratically, and it wasn't like a revolution. He gives a speech before their parliament, and I was cringing the whole time reading it. Not because it was a bad speech, but he's like giving this speech to all the reactionaries still sitting there in parliament about all the like shit that they were going to do to like take away their power. And it's like, dude, they're sitting there in front of you with power. That's why they're in the parliament right now. And it's not shocking that he did get couped. But yeah, I mean, it's still terrible, but anyway. But also somewhat predictable, not following sort of, typical Marxist practice. Boy, got some dumb trolls in here. You're a monarcho-socialist. Please develop a coherent worldview and then get back to us. All right. We are just about caught up with the chat. So thanks to everybody who showed up today. I'm going to wrap it up here. We're going to continue this article tomorrow. I've been starting these streams at slightly different times. I have some stuff going on tomorrow, so I'm not sure exactly when it's going to begin. We had been doing 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, and recently I've been doing more like 1 Pacific, 4 Eastern, and I kind of prefer that. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to start it at that time, but I'll post that. Expect a stream tomorrow. We'll see exactly which time it starts. It starts at. But anyway, thanks again to the patrons and everybody else for helping to make this stream what it is. Thanks if you're listening on YouTube, and we will see you again next time.